On this week's episode of Serverless Chats, Rebecca and I chat with Dave Anderson about Serverless-First engineers and the Flywheel Effect. This is Serverless Chats, episode number 128. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Daly.
And I'm Rebecca Marshburn.
And this is Serverless Chats. Hey, Rebecca, what's going on?
Hey, Jeremy. Not a lot, just having breakfast, drinking some coffee. What about you? What are you up to?
Well, I actually have been on a bit of a health kick recently.
Do tell.
I have lost 14 pounds in the last couple of weeks. I went to reInvent and I think I was breathing too heavy. So this is part of my, I'm trying to reduce my carbon footprint by weighing less and needing less oxygen. So that's my goal. But I also have a vacation coming up. So there might be some vanity in this as well, but let's go with the sustainability. Let's go with that first.
Yeah, and I think my biggest health kick is that, I eat salad for breakfast. What are you up to? How are you feeling about it?
I am doing the keto stuff, which I've done in the past. And the first couple of days you kind of run down, whatever. But then once you get into the groove of it, it's like bread and all that kind of stuff. Like, I can do without it. So, but I've been exercising a little bit as well. But actually, speaking of healthy living, our guest today is a marathon runner, or a marathon level runner, and from what I hear, an avid mountain biker. But he's also a brilliant mind when it comes to technical and strategic leadership. He's a huge advocate of serverless, or the serverless-first approach, I should say, and a Wardley mapping expert. Would you like me to introduce him?
Yes, please do. Edge of my seat.
All right. So our guest today is a contributor at the Serverless Edge, a co-host of the Serverless Crack podcast, a technical fellow at Bizarre Voice. He is our friend from Norn Iron, Dave Anderson. Hey, Dave, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. I thought you were talking about someone else there. I thought your kind introduction. You're too nice. Thank you.
Well, I have my first question is, have you run any marathons lately?
I ran Belfast a few months ago, and I'm planning on running Belfast again now on the start of May. So just did a long run last night, so I'm kind of sleepy here.
A long run last night. Well, I can't say I did the same, but I'm very proud of you.
Yeah, it was tough.
I try to get like 3 miles in every once in a while, and that's pretty much enough for me. I can't do the marathon thing. My body is not built for marathon running.
No, it's thinking time. That's the way I think about it. Thinking time. Good time to listen to a few podcasts.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
That also is perfect because it leads us into our first question. I'm curious if you could, this doesn't really lead into the first question, but I'm going to make it. We're going to shoehorn this. When you think about things, in your mind, what would you say? Like, how would you tell the audience a bit about what you're doing in your role at Bizarre Voice and what led you there?
So Bizarre Voice is a really interesting company. They're about 15 years old, based in Austin, and they supply a lot of the user-generated content for e-commerce and online retailers. So something like 65% of the top brands use Bizarre Voice for reviews, question and answers, and kind of social commerce content, which is I think there's something like 12,000 brands and retailers. So really my role there as technical fellow is really looking at the technical strategy of the company and how do we kind of move forward. It's kind of like a startup that's 15 years old. So it's been really exciting joining there. I've been there for about the last 4 months or 5 months. And it's a really exciting industry to be in, kind of, retail. It's new to me, so lots to learn. But definitely it's really fast moving and a lot of really, really great engineers. So it's an exciting kind of growth area for cloud, and we're all in AWS, which is cool as well. So lots of stuff to play with.
Yeah. So you have a little quote or whatever on the Serverless Edge site where you talk about being passionate about driving technical strategy, and helping others with the transformation journey. And then, just that you've done this, you've led several enterprise slash organizational change efforts over the course of your career. And one of those places, which we have to mention, is Liberty Mutual, or Liberty Information Technology. You were there for 14 years. And you were a major part of that serverless transformation and the effort there. I'd just love it if you could tell the audience a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it was a fantastic journey over the past kind of few years. And really, I was lucky enough. I took it like a CTO role with Liberty IT back in 2013, and that was just about the time that we were starting to talk to AWS. So I was at the table when we had these initial conversations with AWS, and the thing I noticed was the conversation was almost security led. It talked about security and policy and stuff, and I had a small team at the time with a few architects. There's only 3 or 4 of us, and I kind of realized there is potential here to reinvent how we write applications. It's like, while everyone's figuring out, network security, governance, all that good stuff that needs to happen first, we need to figure out how do we build applications in the cloud. And we were lucky enough, we had a few people at reInvent in 2014 where, hey, Lambda was launched. Right. So in 2015, we started playing around with Lambda as, is this a potential direction we could go in? And we started thinking about things like, how do we get rid of the operational burden and build functionality quickly? And that became Serverless-First. And we used a bunch of things like Wardley mapping, etc. And we just started to create this approach to form this idea of Serverless-First in a big enterprise. And we just kept going. We kept getting quick wins and another win and making massive impact. And we'd take applications that were like $50,000 a year to run, and we'd turn it back to $10 a year. And people were just blown away by some of the change we were driving, and just created this almost like a movement around the organization about this different way of building. And sometimes it's not about the detailed explanation of why. It's just like, this is faster and cheaper. People are like, okay, I can get on board with that. It was great as well because at Liberty IT in Belfast, the team grew to about, I think, 12 architects with a whole bunch of people we can talk about later. But we had expertise right around the entire enterprise. So we started thinking and said, could we frame Liberty Mutual as a Serverless-First enterprise? It's kind of like go big or go home.
Right.
And people started listening. So it was an incredible story. I'm so proud of the work we did there. I'm sure we can talk about the team, but it's just, there's so many ways we drove that different mindset. And I'm really delighted to see more stories today about the great work that's happened at Liberty Mutual. So it was a fantastic experience.
I just thank you so much for you knowing and sharing that like deep origin story, where you said, 2014, you're like, wow, there is potential here to reinvent how we write applications. And then you drew that out and it ends up being, there's potential here to redo how you do business, right? To go from $50,000 spending $10 on something and applying that across an organization that probably has a lot of 50K spends in different places. So that led to this idea, it sounds like, where you the nomenclature, right? You called it or named it Serverless-First. Wondering if you can define what Serverless-First means to you and to the Liberty org, and whether or not that changed over time.
Well, it was kind of what we from a few different efforts of change, you realize that sometimes if you're extremely detailed up front, you turn people off. So we just started talking about Serverless-First and a different way of building, and we started to slowly define what that meant. So we started to say things like event-driven, well architected. We talked about the Serverless-First spectrum, start with serverless and managed services and work your way back through, containers and even back to the likes of Cloud Foundry, etc. So really giving people that prioritized list to work backwards from. We talked about engineering excellence, is that we will take great pride in how we build. We'll have empowered teams. So we grew it to be slightly bigger. We'll be driven by a KPI and not just writing a feature, but actually driving a business KPI. So this all led to teams that were more self-sufficient and more responsible. And again, there's a couple of really nice things for Liberty Mutual. One of the phrases was responsibility is our policy. We're like, yeah, we can work that into it. One of the phrases with Auto was the fact that only pay for what you need. for your auto insurance. We thought, okay, that sounds like a serverless thing. You only pay for what you use. So we started folding in the corporate kind of directions, which are really solid, and linking them back to what the engineers were doing. Engineers loved this because it was all of a sudden tying us to the business. And then when we did sit and talk to the business, we were talking the same language. So having that consistent language from the engineering teams to the business leaders, it just was incredible. This idea of experimentation as well. You could try things really quickly and see if it worked, and then you'd have the scale there if needed. So it's just about tying those things together the whole time. So it's just fascinating to see how it grew.
So you talk about all of this work that Liberty Mutual did, and all these sort of, just the evolution of that serverless first mindset and what that meant within the company. And we have a mutual friend, Matt Coulter, who built that CDK patterns library. And then we just had Christy Peralt on our last episode. She's from the US, works with Liberty Mutual, and she was talking about the internal patterns library, that's available so that, developers can just grab this right off the shelf. And then not only can they start quickly, but also follow a bunch of rules and standards and all these things that are already approved. So this is amazing, right? And just super well implemented. We've heard of other companies like Lego, for example, that have teams that are just about, basically, accelerating their development process. They've even gone and extended the Well-Architect framework to make it more stringent for their particular needs. And I'm just curious, Liberty Mutual, Lego, some of these bigger organizations have very, very large IT departments or very large development teams. So it makes sense that they can do this. It's not quite as simple for small or even mid-sized orgs to find not only the time and the resources, but like the right people that can actually lead these charges. So I'm curious, from your perspective, as somebody who's done this in a larger organization, but I know I was also working with others, is this just immaturity in the space? I mean, it's been 5+ years now, but it's still a bit of Wild West out there, right? So is this just something where we think, it just needs to mature more and all the tools and the best practices will be out there? Or do you think that this is still something that most organizations are going to need to deal with for a while and kind of go through their own learning or on their own journey, I guess, to discover the benefits and the best practices and the implementation that works for their organization?
I would hope that I think a better understanding of how engineering works. Engineering has to be part of the organization. It's not the IT department. The IT is not a cost center. It's a value driver. So I think when companies appreciate and realize that, and you can let into engineering teams build valuable, then the question becomes, how can I help the engineer teams build quickly? One of the initial ideas myself and Mark McCann had is about the act of enablement, technical leadership through enablement. It's leading from the back of the room. And as people joined my team, we led from the back of the room. We enabled other teams to be successful. And it was often the thing where you sat back and you weren't really in the front line. So I think the idea of providing enablement capability to teams is really powerful. You're not kind of driving the teams to, type in code faster. That's not what it's about. It's how can you give the teams the tools to do what they need to do. We had several attempts at finding that tool set. We had a couple of failed attempts at building that internal developer platform. But it was when CDK came out that we seen there was real value there. And I'd been trying to push inner source for several years before that. But Matt, I think, joined the team in about 2019. And the first thing I signed to was CDK. Is look at that. We think there's potential in that because we could see that CloudFormation was slowing people down. So that idea of creating the building blocks you need, and the Lego analogy is brilliant. Adrian Cockcroft talks about having better bits of Lego that you can build your systems with. But you need to be very clear in what kind of guardrails you're going to put in for your engineers and what tools you're going to give them. And you really need to understand, where your value proposition is. There's far too many companies building what I would say too low down the stack. And they're trying to build too much stuff. Right. So I think there's a little bit of companies understanding what their engineering is for and giving them the right tool set to do that. I think the tools are there today if you want to take that approach. Like CDK patterns is absolutely awesome to take those patterns in and those higher level constructs, but you have to have engineering leadership who are going to pave the way and let those things happen. But the thing I was able to do in Liberty Mutual was go into the C-suite, the executives, and say, we're going to take this approach to get this benefit. People are like, okay, I'm good with that. If you don't join the dots into the C-suite, then you're sometimes you're fighting a losing battle. So I think it's really important to it's often a different message you put into the C-suite than when talking with the engineers. But sometimes, you need to think of it this is how we're going to deliver value for the organization using these tools. So I think the tools are there, but maybe not the attitudes in engineering leadership in some companies.
Now, I've never known any company to be slowed down by cloud formation, though. So,
Yeah, now you're just talking crazy talk now. That's such a mirthful laugh, Jeremy. Dave, you discussed a few things that maybe failed in the beginning, or you all were like working through internally. Okay, how do we apply this type of like thinking, and how do we help spread that across the org? Can you talk a little bit more about some of those internal adoption struggles initially, and then what helped you sort of build out of those?
Well, one of the best techniques that we started looking at was wordly mapping. We started wordly mapping probably about 10 or 8 years ago. And it took a long time to figure out how to do it. But eventually when this idea of Genesis, custom, product, commodity, when that finally landed, we were able to look at things and say, that's a commodity. This thing is custom, it needs to be product. How would you move certain things? And I'll give you a good example of that. A lot of our traditional guys spent a lot of time working with infrastructure and security. Spent a lot of time in those groups, working with those really brilliant professionals and engineers. But infrastructure always want to build a front in front of something. Let's build a front before AWS so you can go through this thing to get to AWS. And you're thinking, guys, we don't need to do that. That's not providing us any more value. Let's just write some really good standards and not build a front in front of everything. So there was always that early approach to let's wrap the cloud in something, and you just know that you're going to run out of road if you do that. So those things like that. We for a while we get too opinionated. We built the most amazing framework to do everything for you, and it got too bloated. So right. we protected developers, then we get too opinionated, and eventually we got to the idea that let's open things up and take this inner source approach where we let engineers change things. We trust them to add value, but we provide some guardrails, and the knowledge for that was through well architected. So it was definitely a learning experience. But I think at the end of the day, developers need to have control of what they're doing, which is really important.
Right, and I want to dig into Wardley mapping a little bit later, but let's go back to talk about trusting developers, right? So trusting developers, I mean, we should be able to trust them as long as they are up to date and they know the technologies that you're using. So you have this evolution of developers who were writing code, throwing it over the wall, somebody else is handling that, moving to this idea of a serverless-first developer. And you wrote a great article, I think maybe last July, about the evolution of the serverless-first engineer. So could you talk a little bit about that and what you mean by a serverless-first engineer, and really what do you need to do now, or what is a serverless engineer, maybe? A serverless-first engineer, sorry.
Well, I mean, the whole idea is that I think the most important idea is code is a liability. I think that's the key idea behind that attitude, that you're going to try and avoid any operational overhead and write as little code as possible. And you're happy enough to pass on certain capabilities to the cloud provider. I think that's the most important thing. I think this idea of being able to kind of break up what you're trying to do and think about what do I need to write versus what would I like to write. That's a big leap of faith, I think, for many engineers. And again, I think there's certain things like eventing and and how you write your functions, etc., is all very important. But I think being very clear on the business outcome that you're trying to achieve, I think is the most important thing. I know Shane Bracelas from Lego talks about the rocket ship. Is that once you start writing in this way, you're on a rocket ship where you can't really get off. You're almost committing to this constant evolutionary architecture of what you're doing, where it's you're always optimizing and improving things. I think that's very much a mindset. It's sometimes the engineers that have kind of stopped learning that find this as a difficult place to kind of go. But there's always engineers that are hungry to learn the next thing, and that's some of the engineers that really enjoy this kind of serverless first kind of environment. I've had many conversations with engineers that were maybe apprehensive about serverless first or didn't quite understand why. And I think there's a bit about reassuring those engineers that this is actually a good direction to go in, and we can actually it's a better space to be an engineer, and you can build more quality. There's a lot more things you can do as value add. So I think there's a whole package around being a serverless first engineer. I think is really interesting, but it's not very understood. I don't think it's a great phrase, serverless first engineer, because it's quite difficult to describe. But there's a certain mindset there that's kind of always evolving, which I think is interesting for engineers.
I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. So we recently spoke with Eric Johnson, who is a DA at AWS, and he was really excited because he's now going into universities and sort of piloting this program by teaching serverless ideas, or like, the paradigm shift to engineers in university who are still learning, like C#. And so I'm wondering, as you're bringing new team members on and like new serverless first engineers, you're talking about like, hey, it's kind of hard to find people who are already thinking in this way, or, maybe you find a great engineer, but then you have to establish whether or not they buy into the paradigm or want to shift to the paradigm, or just like can step back and be like, okay, yeah, I'm going to develop in terms of what I actually need to write versus what I would like to write. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about how you've seen that evolution with engineers, because I imagine that, even still the crop of engineers coming out of university, let's say, the younger folks they may have been exposed on their own, but they haven't been exposed in terms of what they've been learning and the traditional methodologies of learning.
Mm. I think the mindset is engineer over programmer. I think that's an absolutely critical mindset switch. If your job is to write code, then you'll write code. If your job is to engineer a solution for whoever you're dealing with, your stakeholder, then it becomes a completely different proposition. And often I think coming out of university, you've got programmers, and then you need to almost convert them into engineers. How do they solve problems? I think technical coaching is a huge part. And I spent, if you think about old team at Liberty, I think we had, a really strong team. I think we had 4 serverless, we had 4 heroes, AWS heroes, and a really, really strong group of people. We spent a huge amount of time speaking to engineers, coaching people through. We do lots of kind of engineering excellence kind of reviews. And I was like a broken record. People would say, I've written this great thing, yada, yada, yada. And say, well, what's the business KPI? Or where's the value? Or how much did that cost? Just bring in a subtle commercial question to, okay, love the fact that pattern is really cool. That's brilliant. But what problem is that solving? For who? And then people say, well, yeah, it's a really complicated. Well, could you not just use step functions for that? I think so, but I really like this language. Okay, well, that's good. But so bringing it back to, and I think it's really powerful for engineers coming out of college. They have those technical leadership role models that will ask them the right questions. I think the old idea of the technical leadership is, grilling the engineer. You have to do this, catching them out, putting people on their kind of back feet. That's completely broken for the modern way of work. You want someone who has done this before, who's got some experience, who could maybe point out, well, why did you do that? It's more of a coaching conversation to help people learn in a safe environment. So I think that's really important to kind of bring people new into the industry, into that way of your role is to engineer solutions for your business partners. And that's where I think serverless really comes into its own, because you can do that quickly and you can be laser focused on that.
And I love that phrase, sort of taking people from programmers to engineers, or transforming them into engineers, because I think of it now as like, you almost don't want to hire programmers, you want to hire cloud architects, right? Because you have to think all the way through. And I think about how much code I write now. Even when I'm building an application, I'm like, did I really only write like 100 lines of code, and that does, and then I plug into, then I write either 10,000 lines of CloudFormation, or I use a framework. But essentially, all that CloudFormation or whatever framework I use to transform it into CloudFormation, essentially that does 90% of the work that I normally would have had to do in the past. And one of the things you mentioned in the article is this idea of cognitive burden, right? And that idea of sort of thinking through all the way from, what is it that I'm trying to experience? Or what am I trying to accomplish? You mentioned this idea of what's the business value there, and putting all that in. I think a typical programmer has always been a problem solver and always trying to solve those problems. But this is just, I don't want to say it's harder. I mean, because I think it's more exciting. I think it's more interesting. Like you said, you have more freedom. You can do more things. You've got more control. You have more control by giving up control, which is kind of crazy. But if you think about it that way, but I'm just curious, like, what is that? What are those extra bits of cognitive burden that we do put on developers that are moving into this sort of cloud architect space?
I think that's the two funny stories about that. I always remember I was working on a stack a while ago, a good few years ago, and one of the engineering leaders was curious to why it was taking so long. And I said, well, look at how we've designed the stack. There's many layers to the stack, and there's about 3 people who know the entire stack.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a conversation with one of those engineers and you ask them a question, you can see the cognitive burn in their eyes as they try and think through this huge call stack. It's just too complex. We haven't used like domain-driven techniques to break this down into kind of, like as Dan North says, this doesn't fit in my head. I think with some of the cloud architectures, if you do break them up properly, things can't fit in your head, So I think it's old architecture that's decades old, but it's just the fact that break things down properly and they will be simpler. As Brian Foote says, don't design a big ball of mud. That's not good for anyone, And then the second thing is around kind of programmers. I think programming is still important. It's still really important to be a good programmer. But I remember getting up in front of Liberty a few years ago and saying that the junior engineers were the best programmers in the company. And saying the junior engineers are better programmers than the architects in my team. And I got a huge lashback from that. Specifically, Gillian McCann was really angry. She was like, I am one of the best programmers in this whole company. And I was like, actually, yes, Gillian, I think you're right. But I was illustrating the point. You're also the best engineer in the company. So, so there's something about having the experience, or especially in the cognitive burden, to know what you don't need to do. Good engineers know what they don't need to do, and that's the difference. You're almost simplifying as you go.
So let's talk about some of those, some of the ways that you distill these lessons and then share them out with folks. I would definitely want to talk about the serverless edge. You got a lot of things going on, right? You got like blog posts, you got some team members, you got newsletters, events. Can you talk to us a bit more about what the Serverless Edge is and why you and Mark McCann started it?
Yeah, so it's a funny story actually. After I left Liberty, I've been speaking to a bunch of people across the industry, and it was actually Adrian Cockcroft. He said, you need to write a book. I was like, no, I'm just going to take a few months off and then start. He said, no, you need to write a book. It's really important. So I said, okay, I'll see if I can write. And I ended up putting together a book which we're publishing with IT Revolution towards the end of this year. And really it's around and I've got the Serverless Edge is the blog that we discuss some of these topics. And really the Serverless Edge gives you an advantage over many other technologies because it makes you go faster. And really what I've tried to illustrate in the book is when you take business strategy illustrated by Wordly mapping and technology strategy illustrated by Serverless-First, and if you can combine them together, there's a flywheel effect that absolutely propels your company into a different stratosphere. And you can see a few companies who have done this. I'm sure you guys have spoke to some companies who have really gotten that really tight. And once your engineers understand what the business strategy is and what it's not through something like Wordly mapping, and once your business realize how they can ask for things and how they can get technology moving for them, it's the IT department is gone. You're on steroids moving forward. So it's really, so this idea of the value flywheel is something we've kind of created to try and illustrate that, is to kind of talk about how do you get that flywheel effect working within your company. So really within the book that's coming out, and IT Revolution have been awesome. And I've been speaking with Gene Kim over the book and talk to some of those authors, which is great company to be in. They publish like Accelerate and Team Topologies and a bunch of really fantastic books, the DevOps Handbook. So being in that company of authors has been great to kind of propel these ideas forward into a whole new kind of space. And then actually teasing out the ideas with my two co-authors, Mark McCann and Mike O'Reilly, has been really good to actually, flesh this out and get some of these ideas out in the community.
So you've mentioned a few times, I know that Jeremy promised at the beginning of this podcast that we'd get back to it, but I think it's probably time that we talk a little bit about Wordly and Wordly mapping as a tool to drive transformation and the Wordly strategy cycle. And I really appreciated how you had brought the idea up of the Wordly strategy cycle, because I think when people do hear about Simon Wordley and they hear about Wordly mapping, but there's like a cyclical, like a loop involved in it too, right? The Wordly strategy cycle. So will you talk a little bit about those two things, and then we'll come back to how they apply to more about the serverless edge?
Really, we first started speaking to Simon and talking to him, and I joined some of his research groups over the years. But as we started to use Wordly mapping as a technique within Liberty Mutual, it just became really powerful, because we'd have a team in a very complex area. We would map out what they were doing, and it would become immediately obvious the things they didn't need to do. I used to get some reactions like people going, "Why are we doing that?" You go like, "Bingo, that worked." So people would automatically say, "Why are we spending so much time doing this? We need to move that into product." So this idea of this mental model of how visible is the work you're doing to your stakeholder? Is it right front center, or is it buried a few layers down? Plus, where in the evolutionary cycle is this? Is it Genesis custom, where it's brand new, or is it product utility? You should be just renting it from someone. So that was a really powerful way to have the discussion. And then as you get into the strategy cycle, you talk about doctrine. What are the core tenets or hygiene factors that are within the company? Like common language, communication, quality standards. There's a whole bunch of hygiene factors that we talk about that should be within a company. Do you have alignment through mapping? And then, getting into things like landscape and orientation and how you actually executing those things. So I think that's a fantastic model. But what I did was really apply some of those thinking into the book, into that what I call the value flywheel. So really, we've got these 4 different kind of areas where it's like purpose. Are you really aware of your purpose as an organization, as a team? Do you know the North Star of what you're doing? And this was something done a million times. When you talk to a team, they tell you about their amazing Kubernetes stack and say, "Well, why are you doing that?"
Right.
So boom, straight away, down to the business problem. Then challenge. Can you map out what you're doing? And are you open enough to receive challenge from people? Maybe we have all the tech, but we have the wrong team. So there's a socio-technical thing there. That do you have the right structure? Are you challenging what you're doing? And then next best action. Are you going to execute quickly on that? Serverless-First developer experience. Like, can you get that in production tomorrow? It's going to take you 6 months. And then long-term value, like sustainability, well-architected. Are you putting well-architected standards into what you're doing? So even though you've written something quickly, is it well-architected? And then that drives you to push on the purpose even more. So once you start that flywheel effect going, you make rapid progress. So I think Simon Wardley's work was brilliant for getting us into that mindset. And I've said this to Simon, but his language it's very research driven. It's hard to get your head around. He says it takes 7 years to learn mapping, and he's probably right. So what we really did in the book, myself, Mark and Mike, was kind of take that and kind of make that slightly more accessible. And how can you apply that and really the tagline is, okay, you've migrated to the cloud. Now what? Do you have a nice data center? Are you actually ready for the flywheel to take off?
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that because I actually had a question about this where we've had a lot of guests talk about Wardley mapping. We've had Simon Wardley on this podcast where we talked about Wardley mapping, but and in 7 years, like I'm still trying to learn Wardley mapping. So I think he's right on that. But when I think about all these guests we've had, including Simon, who is brilliant, and the whole abstract of it is brilliant, but the actual application of it and bringing it into an organization, it's sort of like, I always joke about this. You're reading a tutorial, you'll get to step 4, and then step 5 somehow skips over 700 steps. Like that's how I feel like bringing Wardley mapping into an organization. So how do companies do that? I mean, this book is obviously a great first step for them, but beyond just the principles of Wardley mapping itself, applying those within the organization, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I think the language is really important. Actually, mapping itself is kind of dangerous. If you're going to map with a bunch of executives, it's just be careful, because it's a tough technique. But there's two things we did was really interesting. We created a grid for Wardley mapping. There's layers of visibility, say A, B, C, and D, where A is most visible.
Mhm.
And then we had a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, wasn't like Genesis custom product utility. So we would talk to a team and we would say, where are they? This team's like they're C1. It's product right in front of the stakeholder. That's where you want to be. This team, they're like D2. They're like some custom built madness that's 4 layers away. We say you're too low in the stack. So we get a really simple way of teams realizing where they were, and it's almost like that's where you are and which direction are you going in. You've written something really valuable. Are you trying to commoditize that? Are you trying to create innovation? And we also combine that with team topologies. Are you enabling other teams? Or are you creating value? And once you put those two things together, it's like, well, you can't create value if you're a commodity that's hidden away. No one even knows you exist. So it's really trying to get teams in the right headspace to understand where they're at. So even that language, I think the language of Wardley mapping was even more important than mapping itself. This concept of, product versus commodity. And custom was really important, because a lot of teams, they write something custom and then they never refactor it to bring it into product. It's like the pioneer settler town planner idea that Simon uses. A team can be a pioneering team, but they never move over to settlers or town planners. So it's every team and product is on an evolutionary journey. So it's about talking to teams to where they are on that journey. So I think having someone to sit and talk through the teams with that. And for me, that's a great role of a technical leader or an architect, is to come in and provide that kind of coaching to the team. And then you can't just go in and say, you need to be X. You then say, well, I think we need to move to X, and let me help you get there. And you maybe go and clear the way for them or introduce something. So it's about helping the team see where they go next, and then assisting them in getting there themselves. So I think I think that was super important. But this idea of a common language about the evolution of the team, I think, is really important.
It sounds like you might say about Wardley mapping, especially when you're in front of stakeholders, right? You're like, well, to distill it down, it's with great power comes great responsibility. So don't just wield this tool willy-nilly, especially with folks who aren't necessarily in the right headspace to even consider its implications. And then you certainly don't want to make rash decisions off of maybe something that you sketched out in 30 seconds if the rest of the people in the room don't understand the origins and how to use it. So I love that you're applying, the Wardley strategy cycle and Wardley mapping to your book. So in that book, right, you talk about, what do you say? You broke it into 4 parts. You say purpose, challenge. I'm going to mess up on the third one, and then well architected. What's the third?
Yeah, next best action.
Next best action.
Bias for impact.
Action.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then well architected. And so you have a podcast, the Serverless Crack podcast, in which you talk shop, let's say, with Mark McCann and Mike O'Reilly. And you have I think you dedicate maybe 6 episodes to the well-architected framework, and sustainability is your favorite pillar. So will you talk a little bit about the podcast and then why you dedicated so many episodes to well-architected, and then maybe how that fits into your book itself? Yeah,
well, I mean, we're huge fans of well architected. It's just amazing. The fact that it's 8 years old still blows my mind. It's such a neat idea. And Google and Microsoft also have well architected approaches that are slightly different names but the same stuff. And I just love well architected because I use this internally in every company. It's like it's like your 5 a day. Is if I used to always say we need to introduce well architected as a phrase that everyone understands. That someone can ask, is that well architected? Yes or no. When your doctor asks you, did you eat your 5 a day? You either say yes, because that's 5 fruit and veg. No, I did not. Or you kind of say, yeah, but I kind of had fruit juice, which isn't really 5 a day, but I'm going to count it as 5 a day. If that's your attitude, then the doctor knows that you're not telling the truth. And they say, well, it's your responsibility. So, you do what you need to do. Same with well architected. It's a great way to level out because when you ask people about architecture, they talk in circles. But well architected is quite clear what that is. And I love the fact that they added sustainability to that as a sixth pillar. And again, I talk good friends with Adrian Cockcroft, who's I think the VP of sustainability for AWS. And the whole idea that the cloud provider are responsible for the sustainability of the cloud. So they make sure the data center is running well, and it's your responsibility for sustainability in the cloud. So it's something like 1% of the global electricity bill is on data centers, and that's going to increase something like tenfold in the next decade. So most software engineers are not quite clear on how their designs specifically relate to increased carbon burn. And the one thing that's happened as the cloud providers can measure carbon usage, and as regulations comes in around, carbon requirements for, 2035 or whatever, companies will have to start saying, this is our carbon burn. So there's a direct responsibility for engineers. We now have a number for technical debt. It's not just someone's opinion,
Right.
you actually have a number. Even with the cost in the cloud, you can still hide that with saving plans. So imagine a future where you can actually assess an architecture to see how sustainable that is, and you could look at that. So, and obviously, of course, serverless is the best way to create a really sustainable product. So, I think there's going to be a huge uplift in sustainability as the metric that matters for good architecture. I don't think we've ever had that before. So I'm excited about the changes that the cloud providers will bring out to help us measure, and the change in mindset in engineering teams to actually think about sustainability as something that is a measure for good architecture.
Yeah, I was excited to see the sustainability pillar added because that's I think it's interesting to be focused on. And actually, Paul Johnson and I were talking about this I think 2 years ago now, or whatever it was, like just
Yeah.
saying how important it was, sort of going green with serverless and that being a major driver for it. So I just want to ask a little bit more about the podcast and the conversations you've been having. So I'm just curious how the feedback has been, because Rebecca and I love it when this podcast gets people asking questions or interacting with us or disagreeing with us even, although, I mean, it's hard to disagree with Rebecca and me, but still, if they do. So I'm just curious, have you engaged with some people? Have people reached out to you, and sort of like been inspired by this? Because again, it's super interesting stuff and crazy important.
Yeah, the feedback's been really good. A lot of people really enjoy it. They like the kind of conversation. And what we're kind of trying to do is have nice kind of short conversations that are, almost like bite-sized to try and make some of these things more accessible. We're trying to hold back in our inner desire to go really deep in some of these topics. So we're trying to keep it at a nice high level. And really it's a lot of people are listening to say, it's a nice short podcast. It was really interesting what you said. It encouraged me to go and learn more, and it's really, we're trying to almost have an open conversation between a few people. They're just kind of sitting around having the kind of chat you would have at work, sitting around the coffee table about, about well architected or whatever. And it's not quite, we're not really any vendor specific. We're just kind of shooting the breeze and just having some fun with it. Like, so I think it's nice to kind of almost like level out the conversation and talk about some of because one thing I think about, and I often talk about modern cloud versus legacy cloud. A lot of people don't understand what modern cloud means. So it's trying to maybe give some language, and this is what it kind of feels like for modern cloud, because I think there's a lot of companies who are stuck on legacy cloud, but they don't realize it. So definitely a goal or call to action with some listeners to think, we need to make some improvements. We need to start moving things forward. So I think that's definitely a subtle goal. But the feedback's been awesome, and thanks for the compliments. Really appreciate it.
I don't know how obvious this is, but Jeremy's into podcasts. So he definitely maybe I wouldn't be surprised if he had like 7 questions about the podcast and we had to just like cut them off from here. It's like but this is an open invitation to disagree with us, to challenge us. I imagine Dave probably also gives somewhat of an open invitation for that, but I'll let you speak for yourself in terms of it is, I'd rather listeners interact with us and say like, hey, I don't know if I agree, or I haven't seen it work that way, rather than just be like, oh, listen to that podcast and then like keep going. So yeah, it's congratulations on, it's not an easy thing to stand up, especially to get 3 people around the digital coffee table as often as you do. So it's really exciting. It's fun to listen to. So you're
Thank
talking
you.
about this idea from legacy cloud, to modern cloud, and it reminded me of a quote that you're talking about, like the reasoning behind your book, titled TBD. But you say the need for cohesion between business and technology has never been greater, and we need to simplify the technology narrative. And so it sounds like in a lot of ways, right? Serverless, when you do it right and when you well architect it and when you have this, these, let's say, guide rails of the questions that you ask to help other people understand, like, are you actually achieving the optimal goals behind what the serverless mindset, the serverless first idea, this paradigm is? That's simplifying, let's say, the choices you're making as engineering. And then ultimately that ends up hopefully, improving, or it does end up improving the business. And so the business narrative is pretty simple. It's like, ROI. Like, what is the ROI? Are we like moving fast? Are we executing quickly? Is the feedback loop shorter? Are we making more money for the products that we're serving? Can you talk about what it means to simplify the technology narrative on the other side of that?
I mean, I think there's definitely something around what you talk about as an engineering team. And if you're constantly in the weeds and explaining stuff that people can't really understand, I think you're missing something. It almost needs to be a single language. You want your engineers to talk about the same thing that your business leaders are talking about. I think that's, for me, that's the goal. I find it challenging when the engineer team, they're so deep in the technical implementation as they've almost forgotten why they're building what they're building. And I think one of the things I think is nice about serverless is some of the questions and the challenges are things about, response time versus observability, developer experience. They're higher level things that you can actually talk about. They're not in some weird kind of technology framework that they're not talking a different language than your kind of business leaders. It's like how we want to be more responsive, we want to be faster, we want to be more reliable, we want to be cheaper. You can actually lift the level up that much of the conversation because you're not having to write thousands of lines of code and do really complicated things because the cloud provider does most of that for you. So it takes the focus away, and I think we had a conversation. It almost leaves space for innovation because it takes care of a lot of the lower level stuff and gives you space to think about what can you do for your business leads. I had a great example a few years ago of a team who were brand new to serverless and they had to write an application and they think they had 4 months to do it. And a colleague of mine was the kind of lead, and he says, right, we're going to do this serverless first. They're like, well, we don't want to do that because we don't know it. So we had a conversation. So, okay, we'll learn it and we'll try it. And of course, they used CDK patterns, and they had the application written in like 3 months, which was like, I think they had 6 months to write it. But and I said, well, are you going to deploy it now? And they were like, oh, we don't have to. I said, just deploy it and see what happens. Get through all the security stuff, and then just start seeing what else you can do. So they start doing observability dashboards, start reducing cost. They do a couple of architect reviews. They just, really optimize the thing. So by the time they did a bit of UX work on it, by the time the customer needed it, which is for a very specific date, they had the thing written, they had it tuned, optimized, they were good to go. And it was probably one of the best applications they've ever written. So the fact that they can get the product stood up very quickly and then have extra time to, not harden it, but improve it, to do some of the things that you never ever get to if you're having to write thousand lines of Java code and worry about EC2s and etc.
That is amazing. Well, speaking of long podcasts. We are out of time, but it was awesome talking to you, Dave. So if people want to find out more about you, or they want to find out about the podcast or the Serverless Edge or your new book, how do they do that?
So we're writing on the serverlessedge.com, and that's where all our content is. The book, we're kind of going around the Flywheel Effect for the book, but that'll be published on IT Revolution, and will be listed in, I think it's already listed in Amazon under the Flywheel Effect. That's available for pre-order now. And we also have Serverless Edge Twitter handle, where we tweet some of our material as well. And we're on the usual channels as well, like YouTube and LinkedIn, etc. But I think primarily the serverlessedge.com, and the book will be on the Flywheel Effect. It's listed in Amazon for pre-order.
I didn't realize it was already titled, and man, I was going to be like, are you accepting applications? Like, we could have a little contest around like, name Dave's book. But great choice of name.
Yeah, the Flywheel Effect is kind of, we were thinking about it for a while, but it really resonates with that flywheel effect between kind of business strategy and technical strategy. So there's really something there that once you get those two working in unison, you get that kind of rocket ship effect. Like, so it's pretty exciting, and I hope I hope it hits the mark. It's exciting times.
Yeah, that's awesome. Congratulations on that. All right, well, we will put all that stuff in the show notes. Thanks again, Dave.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the time. Really appreciate it, and great to catch up.
It's our pleasure.
And that's this week's Serverless Chat. Rebecca and I want to give a huge thank you to Dave Anderson for being our guest this week. If you want to check out the show notes and a full transcript of this episode, you can find them at serverlesschats.com/128. For more Serverless Chat, subscribe, sign up to be an insider, check us out on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can connect with Rebecca on Twitter at Becca Odelay and me at Jeremy_Daily. And if you want to keep up to date on everything serverless, make sure you subscribe to the Off by None newsletter at offbynone.io. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to chatting with all of you again next week.